Well, hey, everybody. Long time no listen. Is that a phrase? Long time no listen?
It is now.
Because they can't see us right now.
Oh.
But this is the In Context podcast 2.0, 2.5
I don't
reboot.
know. We're on some
We're
reboot
not-
number 3.
Yeah, we're not Windows 7 or whatever. Which one's the bad one? I don't know. I'm a
I
Mac
like
guy.
Windows 7.
Do you? Okay,
Yeah.
I'm a Mac guy, so I stopped Windows
Windows 8
early.
was the bane of my existence.
Okay, got it. Is that when they try to make it super cool?
Yeah, they tried to make it feel like Mac and failed.
Yep. No, that won't work. If you're a Windows guy, we apologize. Or gal, we apologize to you. Brandon does. I don't, actually. But we're glad you're joining us here today. We're actually here to talk about the Bible because we, at this podcast, one of the things we want to do, and at our church, Stonebridge Church in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, we want to lift up the Word of God. So everything that we talk about, we want to filter it through what does God have to say about this? How does God weigh in on this?
Yep.
And so we are trying our best to make our way through things that we preach and then other topics as well. So we're excited to be back with you and looking forward to getting back on the regular with our podcast. So we're excited about that. We just started a sermon series in the book of Hebrews. Okay. So we are going to talk a little bit, especially for those of you who join us who are either members, attenders here at Stonebridge. We're going to talk about why Hebrews. Why do we need Hebrews?
Yeah.
Because Martin Luther had no time for Hebrews, right?
I thought it was James. I get mixed up on it. Yeah.
I think there were a couple of them.
He despised James.
But yeah, there were some, and some scholars go back and forth with Hebrews.
Yeah, I mean, it's a puzzling book in lots of ways. It was one of the ones that was more later in the kind of universal recognition in the canon.
Right.
Still within the first couple of centuries, but not like it was 1500 or something. But
right.
And it's different from all the other epistles. Like we're not told who wrote it. We're not told who it was to.
Right.
It reads almost more like a sermon than an epistle, although you've got this conclusion at the end where he's like, greet so-and-so, and Timothy says hi, and whatever.
Right.
And so it's just a unique book in its shape, and it's unique in its content in a lot of ways.
Right.
I mean, no other letter is this explicit about quoting the Old Testament. And the arguments are very carefully constructed, very long, sometimes circular.
Right.
And so it can be an imposing book on first read.
Sure.
And so, but as far as why Hebrews?
Why Hebrews?
Why now?
Why?
There's all sorts of factors, some that can go into choosing a book for a sermon series, and I'm not going to go into like the more general ones, but there's a number of reasons I'm excited about Hebrews right now. For us at Stonebridge, one is just the continuity that it provides coming out of the Sermon on the Mount, which we looked at last fall, which is all about the way of Jesus and walking in that way and what it looks like to follow him. Hebrews helps us understand what does it take to actually stay on that road, to stay on that way, to finish well.
Right.
Because a lot of people get started on that road and don't finish well.
Sure.
Unfortunately, it's a sad reality, and Hebrews is very burdened with that.
Right.
That we would finish well.
Also when we get into Hebrews, it's also one of those books that for me has, depending on where you land theologically, can cause some very interesting dialogues between those of us who would be very, very securely in the assurance of salvation, and some who seem to think that there are arguments for, I guess backsliding would be the term I grew up with, but
Sure.
like warnings against. So there's theologically there's some landmines, maybe not the best place.
Absolutely. You have these beautiful, just soaring affirmations and encouragements.
Right.
Mixed with sober,
stern warnings.
warnings, and I think there's any attempt to smooth that tension out I think misses the book. Like we need to hold both of those up. Now, how you sort that out on the flowcharts of systematic theology, we'll talk about that this season. That's probably.
Good. That's good.
But you're absolutely right. It could be a challenging book.
Right. And so the transition then from the Sermon to the Mount into Hebrews is, and maybe an amplification. Is that worth
think
talking
so.
about in terms of Christ, who Christ is, and why
Yeah.
we should listen to him?
Yeah, exactly. Because it tells us less about how to live and more about why to keep living that way,
that's
and
good.
and what's at stake.
Yeah.
Both from the posture of encouragement. I mean, there are so many encouragements to persevere and endure, and from the posture of warning. Like, it does not end well if you don't hold fast to Christ.
Sure. Yeah. So what's the role then? I mean, so the whole book of Hebrews is like there's an idea of kind of copies or substance and shadow, right? The shadow is what we see in a lot of cases in the Old Testament,
Yep.
because even like right off the bat, long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days, He's spoken to us by His Son, whom He appointed the heir of all things, through whom He also created the world. So it's not a denigration of things that came before.
Correct.
But it is a very strong pointing to Christ, away from holding on to those things.
Yes.
Now,
Yeah.
what's the importance of the emphasis of that then, as we look at Hebrews?
Yeah. I mean, there's practical and theological importances. So for the first readers, it seems that they were being pressured quite strongly to revert to Judaism, whether to avoid persecution from the Jews or perhaps even from the Gentiles, because it seems like Christianity was still illegal at this point, whereas Judaism wasn't, and so just come back over. So there's practical realities that that specific occasion doesn't apply as much to us in Midwestern Iowa today.
Right, but what does then? Like, what would be the line from that them then to us now then?
Yeah, I would see a couple of things. I think one is the temptation to try and divorce Old Testament from New. So you could take what Hebrews says about Jesus and use that to tear down the Old Testament. Like, we don't need to pay attention to it anymore. It's irrelevant. I think that would be a mistake.
Sure.
Because, again, he's anchoring his entire argument in the Old Testament.
The Old Testament, sure.
This is a great book for learning about how Christ is the fulfillment of all of Scripture. I think the other side for us today, we may not be tempted to revert to Judaism or to follow the Mosaic law per se, but we have all sorts of cheap imitations that we would hold up. Our own religious traditions, our own religious systems that we turn into kind of a cheaper younger brother copycat of the law.
Yeah.
And whether that takes place in a kind of a traditional fundamentalist scenario where you've got your list of rules for church going and not playing cards or whatever, or whether it takes place in a progressive fundamentalist context where activism and recycling and whatever else becomes the works we must do to gain favor with God and man. And so Hebrews pushes against the legalism in our hearts that shows itself in any culture in any time.
Yeah, man, that's an interesting point too, because even as you just mentioned, we tend to think in categories of legalism and licentiousness, but licentiousness is not. It's a different kind of legalism, right? It's a commitment to living in a way that is still kind of, unless you do these things, you're not truly free.
Yeah,
right?
it's the law of self.
Yeah,
right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure,
It's
but that's
still
an
legalism.
interesting way to look at it. Like because I have always looked at it as the divide between, again, legalism and licentiousness. Do this versus do what you want. But do what you want is kind of a, was it? I think it was Aleister Crowley. I know it's weird to quote him in a podcast, but I think he said, "And the whole of the law will be do as thou wilt." Right? You know what I mean? Like the idea, but it's still, there's something that gets captured there, even in that weirdness of the living for self, is it still is kind of a law that binds you to legalism.
Yeah. And those who uphold that as the premier measure, they will judge you for not being true to yourself.
Right.
Yeah,
sure. It's great.
And, on the other side of that, I do think it pushes against what we would traditionally consider licentiousness too, though.
Sure,
With all of the warning passages and such, that with the temptation to take the gospel for granted, to presume upon the grace of God, as Paul puts it in Romans. So I think that's a huge a huge temptation, which, what I love is, as stern as those warning passages are, we're going to see when we get there, they're always followed up by, but better things are in store for you type thing. We have a better hope. And
Eyes
so
on the prize.
there is an encouragement in that push to persevere and to endure amid suffering, amid the battle of sin, a battle against sin, persecution, and so on.
Right. And so with that point as well, when we look into the book of Hebrews, the thing that we don't want to get bogged down just with the concept of, hey, don't do this. We want to get bogged down with what the author of Hebrews eventually says is looking to Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. So it's really drawing our eyes to Jesus naturally takes our eyes off of the things that we thought were going to be good for our sufficiency, right?
This book is the embodiment of what Thomas Chalmers was talking about with the expulsive power of I forget the exact wording, of
new
a new affection, right? So you can't just say no to something you used to love. You have to replace it with something that is more lovely. And that is how the author of Hebrews argues for endurance and how he argues for persevering, holding fast to Christ, not by just telling us how bad it is if we don't, but by showing us the beauty of Jesus from every single angle. Like, it is just, we've called the series Better, Jesus is Better, which, if you Google sermon series on Hebrews, every church calls their series.
Some form of that, right?
It's so hard to improve because that is such a dominant theme throughout the book, the superiority and supremacy of Christ. He's better than the prophets. He's better than the angels. He's better than Moses and Joshua and better than Aaron and the priests and the priesthood and the old covenant and the old sacrifice. And just the list goes on and on to show from every possible angle relative to ancient Israel's old covenant the superiority, supremacy of Jesus as the fulfillment of all of that.
Right.
And then what you said a second ago, his major instruction, comes in many ways in chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Fix your eyes on Jesus.
Right.
We have this greater hope. We have this confidence. We can draw near. So if you're going to persevere, don't fix your eyes on yourself and your weakness or your strength or whatever it is. Keep your eyes fixed on Jesus. He's better in every way. And so...
But so then a lot of the applications, because, especially when we're preaching through something, people are going to be like, well, what do I do then? Right? Which is a funny response to when we're talking about it. But it's just like to ping back to Hebrews chapter 12, you get the idea of, hey, strengthen your hands, strengthen your knees and look to Jesus. So it's not like there's no effort involved. It's just all the effort that is worth anything is based on the motivation of looking to what Christ has already accomplished, right?
Absolutely.
So then that's all, in some way, shape, or form, what's going to combat our tendencies to drift towards either legalism or licentiousness or any of those things, to drift away into sort of hopelessness in life. What's going to draw us away from that is a continual looking to the work and the person of Jesus Christ.
Absolutely.
As the solution.
Yeah. Remembering what he's already accomplished for us. How, chapter 7 is just so beautiful. Like one sacrifice for all time. Like it is so finished. And looking to him in the present, sitting at the right hand of God, ruling. He always lives to make intercession for us. Like there's so much, which, to your point, it's not that it doesn't involve striving or effort. Strive for holiness, chapter 12, right?
Right.
But all of our striving is flowing from the finished work of Christ, depending on it, applying it, looking to it, remembering it, longing for it. So it is such a Jesus-centered book, and the application is, if the application isn't tied to Christ and what he's done, what he's doing, what he will do, we're not reading Hebrews well, which makes it a challenge in preaching, to be honest, because every single sermon I want to end with chapter 12, verse 1. Okay, therefore, keep your eyes on Jesus. And I don't think that's a foul, but it might feel redundant or formulaic after a while. So, teachers and preachers of Hebrews have to be not creative, but specific.
Yeah, right.
Because again, there you could, if you make the point, all of the points about Jesus being a better priest in chapter 4, what are you going to talk about when you get to chapter 7 when he comes back to that? So you have to kind of pace yourself,
Sure.
and fly as close to the grain of the text as possible, so that I'm applying what chapter 4 has to say about
Right.
Jesus and his priesthood, and letting chapter 7 say what it says. So just, in terms of teaching, preaching, applying, there are challenges in this book.
Sure.
But that's, part of the beauty is we get to hear this call. We get to see Christ from so many angles, hear this call again and again and again, to keep our eyes on him, to hold fast to him, to not let go of our confession. And all of that based on the superiority, supremacy, sufficiency of Christ.
So in a certain way, and I'm taking some license with this, in a certain way, looking at the book of Hebrews as it relates to Jesus is almost like you've been staring at a painting and you know what the painting is, but the more if you have a great work of art in your house, there are times where you'll go, like my wife paints, I think she does a pretty good job, and there are times I'll go up and just look at her brushstrokes and be like, how in the world did she even come up with that to make that? And you step back from it and you're like, man, this is a great picture. But it's even more amazing when you get to look at the nuance of how all those little things come together to create the whole picture.
Absolutely.
So I think that's what it is, right? So if you're parsing out, and if you're listening this morning and you're an expositor, you're a teacher of the Bible, like Hebrews is one of those books where, like Brandon said, you pace yourself. Don't immediately try to run ahead to the overall picture, but take your time to present these aspects that are presenting Christ. Hey, here's one way in which we don't go back to the law because the law is insufficient to really accomplish what we hope it would. But here's how Jesus does that, right? Here's why angels are inferior to Jesus and why we shouldn't focus on this, but focus on this.
It is a wonderful playground, and I don't mean that in a cheap way,
Right,
but a wonderful playground for preachers and teachers, because as you've said, the closer you get, you see this remarkable detail in the brushstrokes. But of course, if you only preach that brushstroke, you end up missing the bigger argument of that section. And so, you have to wrestle with what level of zoom are we going to operate? If you pull all the way back, you miss so many wonderful details.
Right.
We're going, what I would say, at a pretty broad pace. We're taking, like when we get to chapter 7, we'll do that in a single sermon, which sounds crazy and feels crazy, and at times I regret that decision. but it takes him that long to make the main point he's trying to make about Jesus and Melchizedek and the priesthood. And so, and I don't think that's the one right way to do it. That's why I kind of call it a playground. Like you can try different ways of working through at different paces and at different levels of detail. But boy, sitting and staring at a painting that we've seen before, that's a beautiful picture of what this book's inviting us to do. And I'm excited. I'm excited to work through it.
So if you had to concisely say, for this particular series, what is the thing that you hope the most that our people will walk away with?
That's a great question. 2 or 3 things. So, I mean, this is the goal of all of my pastoral ministry, not just the book of Hebrews. I want people to be utterly and absolutely convinced of the supremacy and sufficiency of Jesus. Yeah. Like that is just like this. This is oxygen. Without it, I've got nothing. right?
Sure.
So that is a major goal. But relative to that, then, if I'm convinced of that, that's going to shape the way that I walk with Jesus. Yeah. And so we can get so fixated on different aspects of different challenges in life, different scenarios. I mean, the people that we're being written to, if we think America's weird and hard and getting difficult, and there's real challenges.
Sure. But nothing like...
you have not yet resisted sin to the point of shedding your blood. Right? Nobody's dying in America for their faith right now, right? And yet, when we get our property confiscated, we don't celebrate that. We file lawsuits and what, so, and there's all sorts of angles one can look at those situations. But
Jesus redeems your response to persecution too, right?
if all of my hope is fixed on the world to come, the promised inheritance that all of these great saints died without receiving because they're waiting to get it with us,
right, yeah.
then, and if Jesus is that beautiful and that worth waiting for, that ought to change the way I navigate a broken world. It ought to change the way I put my faith into practice at home, in the workplace. So that's what I'm excited about. Taking that, we looked at the surprising way of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, and that rocked our world, I think, in a lot of ways. My hope is that this brings it, like you said, it amplifies it. It brings it to a new level, bolstered by an overwhelming affection and stability in Christ.
Yeah, right. Man, so, I'm excited.
Me too.
I'm pumped now. I'm glad we talked about this. Well, we would invite you, if you're listening, especially, obviously, if you're a member or attender at Stonebridge, we hope you'll join us through the duration of the series and pop in on the podcast. We'll be talking through some of the specifics as we get into some of these weeks, talking about angels or even Melchizedek and some of the weird stuff like that.
Come on.
We're gonna dive a little bit more into that, maybe give some more background and some Old Testament background to what we can't get to in the sermons. So we'd invite you to join us in that, and we'll also be hitting some other topics through the late winter into the spring. So we're excited. We're excited to be back with you guys, and I encourage you to check out our website if you so desire, stonebridge.church. You can find all sorts of information about our church there. But we're excited to talk about how great Jesus is, and we hope and trust that you've trusted in him. And if you haven't, we'd love to talk to you about that. And if you have, keep your eyes fixed on Jesus, and we'll talk to you next week. Thanks.